As many of you are aware, at the current Human Rights Council 48 regular session, together with a core group composed of Belgium, Benin, Costa Rica, France, Mexico, Mongolia, the Republic of Moldova, besides ourselves, are promoting and negotiating a resolution in which we aim to formalize the main conclusions and recommendations made in the report of the Secretary General on the question of the death penalty. These recommendations include a call to make available transparent data on executions by those countries that have not yet abolished the death penalty, as well as a call to all states to protect the rights of persons facing the death penalty and other affected persons. Transparency in the application of the death penalty is an important safeguard for which we find consensus among states, even if it is not respected by all. More transparent data can shed light to the opaque situation of women sentenced to death. We know very little about who are the women sentenced to death and what crimes they have committed, perhaps because women account for less than 5% of the world's executions. Women are disproportionately affected by punitive drug policies which are responsible for the growth of the female population incarcerated worldwide. Drug-related offenses accounts for almost 30% of the reasons why women end up in prison. Consequently, drug policies and death penalty, the most extreme punishment, are increasingly interconnected. This is a growing concern for many women around the world, as the film in the introduction has also highlighted. These data are presented in the new report by the Cornell Center on the Death Penalty Worldwide in collaboration with Harm Reduction International, the report entitled "No One Believed Me, a Global Overview of Women Facing the Death Penalty for Drug Offenses," report which will be presented today. This report aims to fill the gap over an understudied phenomenon that hinders sustainable development, in particularly SDG 5 on gender equality. We welcome thus the presentation of the report, and we encourage all states that still apply the death penalty to take the findings of the study into consideration and to develop policy responses in their criminal legal processes that comply with international human rights. Further steps towards the elimination of gender-based discrimination and the abolishment of capital punishment are needed, and adequate policy responses can bring us to a more sustainable world. And of course, let me conclude by saying, express my gratitude and really a big thank you to all our distinguished panelists who will now take over and walk us through some of the crucial aspects of human rights, capital punishment, gender, and the use of the death penalty for drug offenses. And also, of course, thank you so much to all of you who are participating this afternoon in this side event. And let me wish you a very fruitful meeting. Thank you. Floor back to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Your Excellence, for such insightful and interesting words. Now, first of all, let me first introduce myself. Sorry for the hiccup we had with the internet. My name is Nombikoni Samantha, the Vice President for the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty. Without saying so much, let me give the floor to Ms. Mona Rishamwani, Chief of Rule of Law, Equality and Non-Discrimination Branch, Office of the Human Rights Commission on Human and People's Rights. Madam, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Madam Coordinator, Excellencies, distinguished panelists, colleagues, and friends. I'm extremely delighted to join you in the opening of this important side event to mark the World Day Against the Death Penalty next week on the 10th of March. 10th of October, what am I saying? 10th of October. And I really thank the co-organizers for bringing us together on this side event, but also all the participants, the 73 participants or so who are with us. As the UN Secretary General has put it, Death penalty has no place in the 21st century. It is an unacceptable and cruel punishment. Decades of research has proven that there is no reliable evidence that the death penalty is an effective deterrent to crime. Any judicial error becomes fatally irreversible. In this respect, we are pleased that several countries have taken positive steps towards the abolition of the death penalty, and that the number of executions have decreased over the last few years. Our report on the report of the Secretary General on this death penalty, A/HRC/4829, which we just finalized, have noted this fact. This affirms that the continued progress in the protection of the right to life and the important steps towards the universal abolition of death penalty. Nevertheless, despite the recent progress, regrettably, in a minority country, states continue to use the death penalty. One context in which death penalty is imposed is drug-related offense, and as we heard, 33 countries retain the death penalty for these offenses. It might be useful in this context to underline that under international human rights law, states that have returned the death penalty should only impose it for the most serious crimes, which have been these most serious crimes have been consistently interpreted as meaning intentional killings. The Human Rights Committee, in charge of the implementation of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, in its General Comment 36 on the right to life, which has a long section on death penalty, the committee explained that crimes not resulting directly and intentionally in death, such as those related to drugs, can never serve as a basis for the imposition of death. The manner in which trials have conducted, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic, raise additional concerns with regard to death penalty, with regard to defense rights and fair trial guarantees in general, particularly when such trials are carried out through video conferences. One group that suffers from the application of the death penalty is women. Research indicates that women operate at the lowest level of the drug trade, yet receive the harshest punishment. Lack of transparency around the death penalty prevents us from having an accurate overview of the scale of the problem. What we know is that women accused of drug-related offenses overwhelmingly come from fragile socioeconomic backgrounds, from ethnic minority backgrounds. Nevertheless, women are sentenced to death for drug-related offenses far more than men. When women who are foreign nationals face trials, they have additional problems, particularly with regard to timely and competent interpretation to their own languages throughout the stages of the proceedings, as well as access to consular services. Criminal justice systems need to take into account women's experience of migration, precarious socioeconomic status, trauma, poverty, child marriage, and gender-based violence. They also need to consider the specific vulnerabilities which women are lured into trafficking of drugs. We saw in the film a clear example of that situation. These include elements of coercion, as well as other issues related to poverty, being heads of households. The fact that most women are underrepresented among law enforcement officials, judges and lawyers in many countries, including those retentionist states, may also add another factor explaining the justice system's inability to take into account women's specific experiences and with regard to the situation. In conclusion, let me state that death penalty is a cruel punishment that is often applied against those who are economically or politically marginalized. It is also a punishment that has not proven its effectiveness. The most effective manner of addressing drug-related offenses is through strengthening the rule of law, ensuring an effective justice system, and reducing drug use by adopting a strong public health approach to prevention, harm reduction, and other forms of health care and treatment in accordance with international law. Let me thank you for your attention, and I look forward to hearing the presentations and the panel today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Mona, for those insightful words. Our next presenter is Ms. Priya Gopalam. Ms. Priya is a member of the UN Working Group and on arbitrary detention. She's a Malaysian lawyer specializing in international criminal law, human rights law, and gender, who has held several positions in the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and at international criminal tribunals and other investigative mechanisms. Ms. Priya will discuss issues related to women, incarceration, and drug policy, also building on working groups' recent deliberation, number 12 on women deprived of liberty and its study on arbitrary detention in the context of drug policies. You're welcome, Ms. Priya. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Connie. Thank you for the kind introduction. Dear Chair, Excellencies, colleagues from other UN agencies and civil society, as well as distinguished participants. On behalf of the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, I thank the organizers for extending the invitation to the Working Group to participate in this important discussion. In my following remarks, I will discuss two documents, a study and a deliberation produced recently by the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, which are pertinent to our discussion and the important topic today. First, the Working Group's latest study on arbitrary detention relating to drug policies, prepared by the Working Group at the request of the Human Rights Council. This study was presented at the Council's 47th session in July this year. The second document is deliberation number 12 on women deprived of their liberty, which is included as an annex to the Working Group's annual report, which was presented during the Council's 48th session in September this year as well. Participants, let me now turn to each of these documents with a view to highlighting issues relating to women, incarceration, and drug policy. First, let me start with the Working Group study on arbitrary detention relating to drug policy. In this study, the Working Group examines how drug policies may result in human rights violations relating to arbitrary detention and makes recommendations. It draws on its own jurisprudence, positions held by other human rights mechanisms, UN entities, as well as submissions from states and other stakeholders. I will now highlight some of the findings and recommendations of the study that are pertinent to our discussion today. The Working Group in the study noted that the punitive drug control laws and policies that continue to be used in many states are ineffective in reducing drug trafficking or addressing the non-medical drug use and supply. Such policies have resulted in the increasing use of arbitrary detention in the context of drug control, with people who use drugs being particularly at risk of arbitrary detention. The so-called war on drugs has resulted in further increases in detention and the imprisonment for drug-related offenses. And evidence shows, as set out in the study, that the so-called war on drugs has failed to address the drug problem. Instead, as identified by the working group, several human rights violations have arisen in the context of this war of drugs, including a wide range of violations of fair trial standards for persons accused of drug-related crimes. I will now turn to the use of the death penalty for drug-related offenses. In the study, the working group also notes that the imposition of the death penalty for drug-related offenses has resulted in the misuse of drug control to silence human rights defenders, journalists, and political opponents in contravention of international standards. As already noted by the prior speakers, drug-related offenses remain punishable by death in many states, and thousands of people are reportedly on death row for drug-related offenses in at least 19 states. According to the working group's jurisprudence, any death penalty sentence following a trial that did not meet fair trial standards would constitute an arbitrary deprivation of life. In the context of the drug study, the working group also observed that the criminalization of drug use facilitates the deployment of the criminal justice system against drug users in a discriminatory way, with law enforcement agencies often targeting members of vulnerable and marginalized groups. And here I will name a few, such as minorities, people of African descent, indigenous people, persons with disability, persons with AIDS, and lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex persons. This list is, of course, not exhaustive. I also note that as women often experience multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination, they may be particularly vulnerable to being arrested or detained on the basis of discriminatory grounds. And with that, let me now turn to the working group's deliberation number 12 on women deprived of their liberty. With the recent 10th anniversary of the Bangkok Rules, also known as the UN Rules for the Treatment of Women Prisoners and Non-Custodial Measures for Women Offenders, the working group was of the view that it was an opportune time to consider and reflect upon the unique challenges that women deprived of liberty encounter. In light of the significant implementation gap between the norms contained in international standards and the lived experiences of women deprived of their liberty, the working group was concerned that women continue to be arbitrarily deprived of their liberty in violation of their human rights, particularly in circumstances where they are detained directly or indirectly because of their sex or gender, and where their gender-specific needs are not taken into account. Against this backdrop, the working group formulated its deliberation number 12 on women deprived of their liberty. In the deliberation, the working group considers the gender-specific dimension of arbitrary detention and provides guidance to assist states and other stakeholders in preventing and addressing arbitrary detention of women in the criminal justice system, but also in immigration detention, administrative detention, healthcare situations, and certain private settings. This deliberation recognizes that not all women experience deprivation of liberty in the same manner, and it is therefore necessary to consider the different and disparate experiences of women who already experience disadvantage. Therefore, in this deliberation, the working group observes that women are at risk of arbitrary detention not solely due to their sex and gender, but also due to discrimination inherently linked to other intersecting factors, which may increase the likelihood of them coming into contact with the criminal justice system, which can then affect the likelihood and length of their incarceration. For example, the disproportionate incarceration of women for crimes related to poverty, which constitutes discrimination on the basis of economic condition or other social status. On drug control laws, the working group notes in the deliberation that criminal and administrative detention as a result of drug control laws and policies disproportionately affect women and can constitute arbitrary detention. Women have high rates of imprisonment for drug-related offenses, as already mentioned by the other speakers, with approximately 35% of women in prison incarcerated for drug offenses in comparison to only approximately 19% of male prisoners. The causes of women's interaction with the criminal justice system in relation to drug offenses are complex and are often linked to other factors such as poverty, and as mentioned by the other speaker, coercion, and may also reflect systematic gender inequality in society more broadly. As such, in this deliberation, the working group urges states to address and take into account the multitude of factors and situations of women who face particular discrimination, which may lead to their arbitrary detention. Finally, deliberation number 12 also highlights issues relating to the conditions of detention of women, recognizing the additional and different obstacles relating to the detention of women based on their sex or gender. With that, I would like to thank you, dear Chair, Excellencies, colleagues, UN agencies, and other participants. I will leave my remarks at that in the interest of time, but I would like to thank the important role played by civil society in this regard with its continuous engagement on these issues. And the working group welcomes the opportunity to continually engage with all relevant actors on these topics and would be very much looking forward to adopting a collaborative approach with all stakeholders in furthering the implementation of the recommendations made in both documents, the study and the deliberations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Priya. Thank you for such beautiful words and good research for the report we've had. To continue further, I would like to call upon all the members that each presenter is given 8 minutes to present. And our next presenter is Ms. Delphine Lotau. Ms. Delphine is the co-author of the new report, No One Believed Me, a global overview of women facing the death penalty for drug offenses, which is being launched with this side event. Until July 2021, Ms. Lotau was the executive director of the Cornell Center of the Death Penalty Worldwide, where she oversaw the center's research and advocacy projects. Prior to joining the center, she has also practiced as a civil rights lawyer in the United States. She has lectured widely on international law and the death penalty, and it has held positions at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda and the Special Court for Sierra Leone. She will present the key findings of Cornell's new report. Ms. Delphine, you're so welcome. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'd like to start by taking my turn to thank the co-sponsors of this side event, not just for their support today, but even more meaningfully for their longstanding engagement on issues of gender, on issues of capital punishment, and on the need to bring a gender lens to the human rights critique of the death penalty. So to the missions of Australia, Mexico, Mongolia, Switzerland, and the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, sincere thanks. Particular thanks to Ambassador Felix Baumann and to Mona Rishmawi for the commitment evident in their opening remarks. And of course, warm thanks to my predecessor on this panel for the work of the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention to bring attention to these issues. Before I start, I'd also like to send warm thanks to our partner organizations in this event and in the long genesis of this report, Harm Reduction International and the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty. And finally, I cannot continue without acknowledging the mighty team of co-authors behind this report. I am not the sole author, many of whom are here today: Charlotte Andrews Briscoe, Laura Douglas, Ariane Jacoberger, and Haley Shapiro. And finally, of course, my thanks to all of you in the audience for joining this conversation. It seems that there are some technical issues with sharing. Oh no, there it is. Thank you so much, Giada. Today, we mark the launch of our study on women who face the death penalty for drug offenses. This report has been over a year in the making, a year fraught with the challenges of a global pandemic. Few groups have endured greater risk or suffered greater harm from COVID-19 than individuals who are deprived of their liberty. And this crisis has underlined the urgency of challenging our existing framework of punishment. This challenge is the lineage of our work. Our report bolsters this growing movement by demonstrating that death penalty drug laws, in addition to many other better known human rights violations, lead to gender injustice. It's been 3 years since the Cornell Center on the Death Penalty Worldwide launched the first global analysis of gender-based discrimination and the use of capital punishment. We were only at the crest of the wave, and since then, gender has become ever more present in the human rights framing of the death penalty and extreme punishment more generally. Why does the focus on gender matter? Here we have a picture of Mary Jane Veloso. On the next slide, there's a slightly larger view. I wish I could tell you her story. We profile her case in detail in the report, and we try to center our report as much as possible on the voices of women with direct experience. But because of lack of time, I won't be able to tell the story, but I thought it very important to have everyone spend a few seconds looking at one of the people who directly suffered some of the gender-based discrimination that I will be describing. So why does the focus on gender matter? It illuminates a key principle of how the death penalty operates. People who receive death sentences are the most vulnerable members of society, those existing at the intersection of multiple axes of discrimination. Simply put, a gender analysis of the death penalty is a powerful way to expose its arbitrariness. It was important to us after our first general overview report to bring a gender lens to capital drug laws because retributive drug policies are an important driver of growing incarceration rates worldwide. Moreover, they have an even greater impact on the exponential growth of female prison populations. Today, around 35% of imprisoned women globally were convicted of drug crimes, compared to 19% of imprisoned men. The death penalty for drug offenses also helps explain the persistence of capital punishment in a number of states that continue to hand down high numbers of death sentences, despite the global trend towards abolition. In states defined by Harm Reduction International as high application states for the use of capital punishment for drug offenses, all currently or recently have had women on death row for drug offenses. Before speaking about global trends, I have to start with a caveat that everyone working in this field understands, which is that access to information on death penalty practices is notoriously difficult. Notably in China, which is a major research field, since it executes more individuals than every other country in the world combined. These challenges were exacerbated, of course, in a pandemic year, and the lack of transparency about who is on death row and why prevents monitoring for human rights abuses, including gender-based discrimination. We also wanted to note that one group of individuals that suffers greater invisibility than others are individuals who are trans and non-binary. We devoted a huge amount of time trying to find information on trans and non-binary individuals facing death, and we came up with nothing. And that in itself is a remarkable indictment of the blind spots that we have when it comes to understanding death penalty practices. For this reason, we can't offer as many global figures as we would like, but we wanted to share a few noteworthy trends. In the states for which we have data, and in particular in the high application states for which we have data, punitive drug policies shape death row, and particularly female death row. In Indonesia, just under half of women on death row were convicted of a drug offense. And in other states such as Malaysia or Thailand, drug policy defines death row. In Malaysia, 95% of all women on death row in 2019 were convicted of a drug offense, and in Thailand, that number was 94%. The second notable trend among high application states is that foreign nationals are vastly overrepresented among women sentenced to death for drug offenses. Many of these are migrant workers. In Malaysia, 95% again of the 129 women on death row for drug offenses in 2019 were foreign nationals. And in Thailand, while we lack the data for death row, we know that 66% of incarcerated female foreign nationals in 2017 had been convicted of a drug offense. Turning now to our reflection on how gender-based inequality impacts women facing the death penalty for drug offenses. Women's pathways to involvement with the drug trade are intertwined with economic need and are deeply rooted in gendered experiences of poverty. This is a consequence of structural gender-based economic inequality. The gendered financial burden of caring for family members, especially among women with little education and without the aid of strong social support systems or access to stable work, is one of the key factors that pushes women into trafficking drugs. Courts often fail to take into account women's history of economic instability and caregiving responsibilities before imposing death sentences. In one case we found in China, for instance, a single mother spent the proceeds of a drug sale to care for her son who had a disability, and the court held that this fact was irrelevant. Although economic need often propels women into drug trafficking, they typically make little money from trafficking. In fact, drug trading is just like their jobs before they became involved in the drug trade, just another precarious position, but one that exposes them to the risk of a death sentence.
To summarize.
Sorry? Oh, have I run out of time?
Kindly summarize.
Yes.
Yes.
My last point is that we found many cases across jurisdictions where gender-based stereotypes influence decision makers in ways that were alarming and disturbing. For instance, we found women transported drugs under the influence of or pressure of a male partner who typically would suffer fewer or no criminal consequences. In one case, and this will be my last point, the only apparent evidence against the spouse of a drug trader who was well known to the police was a ledger that included the word wife. This was sufficient to result in the woman receiving a death sentence while her husband disappeared before serving any jail time. I will stop here for lack of time, but very happy to continue the discussion during the Q&A. And of course, I refer you to our report.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Sorry, I had to cut you off, and it was so interesting to hear from you. Our next presenter is Miss Asia Humadi. Yes, Miss Asia Humadi. Miss Asia Humaida is the public defender at LBH Masyarakat, an Indonesian community legal aid institute, which conducts research, advocacy, and litigation in death penalty cases. Ms. Humaida is a Batha Justice Fellow and has expertise as a litigator, journalist, and activist. She will talk about women's vulnerability before, during, and after the imposition of the death penalty for drugs in Indonesia. Kindly use 8 minutes so that we get some more time for question and answers. Thank you so much, madam. The floor is yours.
Baik, terima kasih. Bapak Ibu yang terhormat, sebelumnya kami mengucapkan terima kasih atas nama Lembaga Bantuan Hukum Masyarakat, atas nama juga Mary Utami karena memberikan dukungan tiada henti untuk klien terpidana mati kami. Di sini saya akan berbagi bagaimana hukuman mati yang dialami Mary juga berdampak pada orang lain. Next slide. Pada sebuah wawancara, Mary Utami pernah berucap begini. Perempuan yang dihukum mati lebih berat penderitaan batinnya karena mereka tidak hanya memikirkan diri mereka, tapi anak-anak yang mereka tinggalkan di belakang. Mary adalah seorang ibu dengan 2 orang anak, seorang buruh migran, seorang perempuan yang dihukum pidana mati atas keluguannya membawa tas yang ternyata berisi heroin. Pada 31 Oktober 2001, Mary ditangkap oleh petugas di Bandara Soekarno-Hatta ketika petugas melihat ada yang mencurigakan di dalam tas yang dipegangnya. Tahun 2001 itu adalah tahun keempat bagi 2 anak Mary, Devi dan Yosi, tidak bertemu ibu mereka. Sejak tahun 98 hingga 2000, Mary bekerja di Taipei untuk mencukupi kebutuhan keluarganya. Devi baru mengetahui keberadaan Mary ketika menemukan potongan koran di kamar bapaknya. Pada saat itu, dia masih duduk di kelas 5 SD, membaca deretan kalimat yang menyebut ibunya adalah ratu heroin dan pergi berlibur bersama laki-laki membuatnya marah. Tapi Devi tidak berani mengkonfirmasi pada bapaknya. Devi terlalu takut untuk menyampaikan pada bapaknya, apalagi sejak penangkapan Mary, Devi tidak diperbolehkan menonton TV. Ini adalah foto Mary Utami bersama anak dan cucunya yang diambil pada Mei 2019, kunjungan terakhir sebelum COVID-19. Akhir Oktober ini, Mary Utami genap 20 tahun, dan bagi Devi sudah 23 tahun terpisah dari ibunya. Sebagai perempuan, ada masa tersulit bagi Devi ketika tidak ada Mary di sisinya, terutama ketika menjelang transisi dari anak-anak menjadi seorang remaja perempuan. Kasus Mary Utami ini adalah potret buruknya sistem hukum Indonesia dalam penanganan kasus pidana mati. Ada 3 masalah mendasar dalam sistem pemidanaan yang menyasar terpidana mati di Indonesia. Ini adalah 3 masalah mendasar yang menyasar terpidana mati di Indonesia. 1, tidak ada hak khusus untuk terpidana mati. Hak atas asimilasi dan hak cuti mengunjungi keluarga adalah hak yang tidak diberikan kepada terpidana mati. Nah, tidak adanya hak untuk mengunjungi keluarga ini adalah bentuk hukuman lain yang sebenarnya diderita oleh terpidana mati, selain eksekusi dan pemenjaraan. Jadi ada hukuman ganda yang diterima sebenarnya. Nah, tidak adanya hak ini membuat Mary tidak bisa hadir saat anak dan ibunya meninggal dunia. Tentu atas kondisi ini, kunjungan keluarga menjadi satu-satunya akses bagi Mary untuk bertemu keluarga. Pertemuan Mary dan Devi setelah pasca penangkapan itu baru terjadi pada pertengahan 2005, yaitu 7 tahun ketika Devi tidak bertemu dengan ibunya. Nah, pada saat itu sebenarnya Devi sudah lupa bagaimana wajah Mary. Pada saat itu ketika dia sampai di ruang kunjungan, dia duduk beberapa meter dari tempatnya dia duduk, dia melihat seorang perempuan yang menatapnya, dan dari kejauhan dia juga melihat bahwa perempuan itu sambil menangis. Dia merasa aneh ketika ada perempuan melihatnya sambil menangis. Kemudian dia bertanya pada bapaknya, karena pada saat itu dia kunjungan bersama bapaknya. Dia tanya sama bapaknya, siapa perempuan itu? Terus sang bapak menjawab, itu ibumu. 15 menit setelah Mary berdiri mematung, kira-kira begitu ya, kemudian Mary menghampiri Devi, Mary memeluk, Mary menangis, dan Mary meminta maaf berkali-kali. Saat itu Devi yang masih duduk di kelas 1 SMP, dia belum bisa mencerna emosinya. Dia masih marah karena koran yang dibacanya, tapi dia juga bingung melihat ibunya yang meminta maaf sambil menangis. Saat itu juga dan hingga hari ini, Mary tidak pernah berusaha menjelaskan masalah yang dihadapinya pada Devi. Di mata Devi, ibunya itu bukan orang yang bukan orang yang berusaha menjelaskan kebenarannya sendiri. Jadi tidak pernah ada penjelasan apapun dari mulut Mary langsung bagaimana kasus hukuman pidana mati ini menimpanya. Kemudian masalah yang kedua adalah tidak ada mekanisme evaluasi pasca menjalani lamanya pemenjaraan. Bagian ini spesifik berasal dari suara hati Mary Utami. Selama di penjara, Mary melihat banyak terpidana yang berhasil kembali ke keluarganya setelah menjalani hukuman. Tapi Mary juga melihat beberapa orang kembali di penjara dengan tindak pidana yang sama. Melihat situasi ini membuat Mary bertanya-tanya, adakah kesempatan untuk orang yang benar-benar berubah tapi tidak mendapat perhatian untuk keringanan hukum? Mary juga menilai seharusnya para penegak hukum atau pemangku kebijakan mengevaluasi adakah motif atau latar belakang perempuan mengapa dia bisa terlibat tindak pidana narkotika. Seharusnya itu juga menjadi kajian dalam evaluasi ini. Kemudian yang terakhir, tidak ada transparansi dalam pertimbangan gerasi. Gerasi menjadi satu-satunya upaya advokasi dalam kasus hukuman mati untuk mengkoreksi putusan dan mereparasi kerugian korban. Namun posisi gerasi yang sepenuhnya menjadi hak prerogatif presiden cenderung tidak transparan. Tidak transparannya ini dalam memberikan pertimbangan apakah gerasi ini ditolak atau dikabulkan dengan dasar alasan apa. Kemudian yang menjadi masalah dalam gerasi selain dari tidak transparannya pertimbangan adalah presiden memutus permohonan gerasi itu suka lewat tenggat waktu dari tenggat waktu yang telah ditentukan oleh undang-undang. Pada kasus Mary misalnya, gerasi itu pernah diajukan pada tahun 2016. Hingga kini 5 tahun berlalu, Presiden Joko Widodo belum juga memberikan keputusan atas gerasi Mary Utami. Proses pengajuan gerasi ini memang bisa menyelamatkan Mary pada eksekusi 2016. Pada saat itu menjadi alasan mengapa Mary ditunda untuk dieksekusi. Tapi lebih dari itu, Mary bukan hanya orang yang perlu selamat dari eksekusi. Dia harus keluar dari penjara dan kembali pada keluarganya. Hukuman yang dijalani Mary itu lebih kompleks dari hitungan angka 20 tahun penjaraan. Ada penderitaan atas perbuatan yang seharusnya bukan menjadi tanggung jawabnya. Efek mental dan fisiknya atas pemenjaraan yang sangat lama. Pembatasan hak warga binaan yang tidak bisa dinikmatinya serta menanggung kerinduan pada keluarganya. Tapi, meski kondisinya penuh dengan penderitaan, Mary tidak pernah merasa menjadi orang yang paling menderita. Mary selalu berucap begini pada Devi, hidup Devi itu lebih berat daripada saya, karena dia berada di luar sana sendiri, di ruang bebas, yang orang-orang terbuka mau membenci dia karena tindak pidana yang saya lakukan. Dan memang ketika kami bertanya pada Devi, apakah Mary Utami pernah mengeluhkan ini? Devi menjawab tidak. Tapi satu hal yang selalu dipesankan Mary Utami kepada Devi adalah hati-hati jika berkenalan dengan laki-laki. Nasihat ini berangkat dari ketidakbudayaan dia yang dimanipulasi oleh pasangannya. Sementara ada juga keraguan di sisi Devi, yakni ketakutan ketika Devi tidak bisa menjelaskan pada anak-anaknya atau cucu-cucu Mary di mana nenek mereka berada. Karena Mary kerap sekali menjanjikan bahwa dia akan pulang dan akan menginap bersama cucunya. Karena kemudian cucu-cucu Mary ini kan beranjak dewasa, semakin dia kritis dalam bertanya, dan dia bertanya, kenapa nenek tidak kunjung datang ke rumah dan menginap? Kemudian, karena juga seiring perkembangan umurnya, cucu-cucu Mary akhirnya sadar bahwa ketika dia mengunjungi Mary adalah bangunan yang dia datangin adalah bangunan yang tidak biasa, bangunan yang penuh dengan jeruji, bangunan yang penuh dengan pemeriksaan. Kemudian cucu Mary ini bertanya pada anak Mary, kenapa tempat tinggal nenek kayak penjara? Bapak Ibu yang berada di ruangan ini tentu ingin melihat Mary Utami bisa kembali bersama keluarganya, bisa berkumpul bersama anak dan cucunya, serta memeluk mereka. Kami membuat petisi online jika Bapak Ibu berkenan memberikan dukungan untuk Mary, agar kegamangan Mary, kegamangan Devi, kegamangan cucu Mary segera menemukan kepastian, serta Mary tidak perlu lagi menjalani hukuman yang semestinya tidak perlu dia lakukan. Demikian yang dapat kami sampaikan. Terima kasih.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this insightful research, and anyone working with children can really connect with whatever you've been saying. Thank you so much, Isia. Our next presenter is Ms. Naomi Buck-Shine. Ms. Naomi Buck is the Executive Director of Harm Reduction International. She has over 15 years of international experience at the intersection of law, harm reduction, HIV, and human rights. Prior to HRI, she has held positions at the Open Society Foundation and IDLO, among others. She is also a member of the Strategic Advisory Group to the UN on HIV and drug use, and a member of the Global Fund Technical Review Panel for Human Rights and Gender. Ms. Naomi will address the human rights and health impacts on drug policies on women. Thank you so much, madam. The floor is yours. Kindly use 8 minutes. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Connie. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to our co-sponsors, our co-organizers, and to the incredible panelists that have spoken before me. As you've heard today, the world drug problem is undermining gender equality. This is true from the women on death row for drug offences to women who use drugs. And today I'm going to be speaking about that spectrum, from basic care and services for women who use drugs to the disproportionate impact of criminalisation on women engaging in the drug market. Women are estimated to comprise about 20% of all people who inject drugs globally, but this is likely to be an underestimate. We simply don't have adequate data or adequate disaggregated data. Women who use drugs endure a pervasive stigma, both in society and in healthcare settings, because of the intersection between the stigmatization of drug use on one hand and entrenched social constructs that box women as primary caregivers and subordinates to men. These conditions deter women from talking about their drug use or seeking services to keep themselves safe and healthy. And it pushes women who use drugs into unsafe spaces to keep their drug use a secret. The lack of data and the hidden nature of women's drug use means that around the world, women who use drugs are poorly served by healthcare services. Harm reduction and drug services tend to be cis male-centered and spaces which do not support the engagement of women. Ideally, services for women would be gender sensitive and integrated, meaning they would consider a woman's needs holistically, including their sexual and reproductive healthcare needs, support for gender-based violence, or mental health issues. Unfortunately, gender-sensitive services are not widely available. For example, only 2 out of 13 Asian countries where harm reduction is available report any specific services designed for women who use drugs. The criminalization of drug use, especially in countries where there are acutely punitive approaches to drugs, including the 35 countries around the world which retain the death penalty for drug offences, also impacts upon a woman's likelihood to engage to seek help or services. In order to change this, women who use drugs must be meaningfully engaged in the design, implementation, and evaluation of harm reduction and evidence-based drug treatment services. Moving along the spectrum from drug use to drug markets, women are affected when they are the partners of people who use drugs and also disproportionately impacted by criminalization of the illicit drug market. Drug offences, particularly low-level offences such as use, possession, or small-scale sale of drugs are among the main drivers of female incarceration in many countries. Globally, 35% of all women in prison are imprisoned for drug offences. 35%. The percentage of women in prison for drug offences compared to other offences is higher than that of men. Now, it is clear that not all women engage in the drug market due to coercion or exploitation. I hope it's apparent that our discussion today is about systemic intersectional inequality and its impact, not about individual agency. Studies show that many women engage in the drug market, including as drug couriers, as a consequence of multiple forms of gendered vulnerability. And Delphine spoke to this so well. And this is elaborated upon in Cornell's latest report, which you must read. Women who are involved in drug trafficking are disproportionately relegated to these low-ranking roles. Again, my fellow speakers spoke about this. And this puts them in a higher risk position. As a consequence of this overrepresentation in lower level roles, women tend to be harshly sentenced for minor involvement in the drug trade. Sorry, I'm just looking at a comment that's popped up from Kokila. Sentencing often fails to take into account all the circumstances of the case and the individual. For women, this means overlooking the social and economic background factors which contributed to their involvement in the drug trade. The further cruel paradigm in this situation is that people with limited power within drug markets are less likely to have the insider information they need to trade for a plea bargain, meaning they end up with harsher sentences. Vulnerable people and people at the bottom of the drugs hierarchy, like women, may also be less able to secure quality legal assistance and may be more vulnerable to torture and/or forced confessions. Research carried out in Indonesia found that more than 25% of women sentenced for drug offences experience torture before, during, and/or after their trials. A death sentence or other form of extreme punishment is often the end result. Moving forward, it is imperative that we abolish the death penalty, decriminalise drugs, and reform drug policy in order to address the disproportionate impact of stigma and criminalisation on women involved with drugs. We must advocate for policies that centre around respecting women's rights and autonomy and seeing the very real intersectional vulnerability which perpetuates this serious harm. Thank you, Connie.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for keeping time. Thank you so much. Our next presenter is, I hope he's around, Mr. Kunan Jaglasikhan. And before I present him, members, you can please help, you're free to send in your questions after the last presenter. We'll be going to the question and answer session. So we want to be more organized and we'll be responding to. Our next presenter is Mr. Kunan Jaglasikhan. Mr. Jaglasikhan is the acting chief commissioner of the National Human Rights Commission of Mongolia and acting board member of the Mongolian Bar Association. Mr. Kunan specializes in human rights and judiciary and began his career at the Judicial Reform Project in 2002 before joining the Ministry of Justice and Home Affairs of Mongolia. He held positions at the UNDP and the Open Society Forum, among others. He will address the experiences of Mongolia as one of the few countries in Asia which has abolished the death penalty. Thank you so much, sir. The floor is yours. You have 8 minutes. Thank you, sir.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay,
Yes, we can hear you.
I'll try to be short. And first of all, dear colleagues, please accept my warm greetings on behalf of the National Human Rights Commission of Mongolia. I would like to thank organizers of this event and all the participants and speakers for your continued support and efforts towards abolishing death penalty. I'm very happy to share Mongolian experience and the National Human Rights Commission's position related to capital punishment. National Human Rights Commission of Mongolia has always been a great supporter of abolishing death penalty. It had conducted many activities and organized many events in order to support the initiative to abolish death penalty. It has submitted several reports to the parliament and also recommendations to the government officials and as well as to lawmakers. And even a commission has assisted a victim in Mongolia who has been sentenced to death penalty 4 times. And at last, the Supreme Court overruled the decision and he proved to be innocent. And the commission, on behalf of the victim, submitted a complaint claiming the compensation. And this was the case, and also this was the push for Mongolian government to adopt the optional protocol to the ICPR, and also to abolish the death penalty de facto and de jure. And I must say that after the transition from Soviet regime to democracy in 1992, Mongolia has adopted a new constitution, and since then it never imposed death penalty for women. Our fourth president, right after his presidency term announced that the death penalty will be no longer in use. Thus, Mongolia has abolished the death penalty de facto from the 1st of January in 2010. It was an important action and commitment from the state head of the state towards the abolishing the death penalty. And in 2015, revised criminal code was adopted by the parliament with no provision on death penalty. And it became effective from 1st of July in 2017. We all know that the pros and the gains of abolishing death penalty existed and still exist. And I must say that it is sad that the politics often manipulates the reality of the necessity of capital punishment. And in Mongolian case, our former president, in order to get public support and sympathy, expressed his intention to reintroduce and to reinstate capital punishment for severe crimes like minors' rape, murder. And even there was established a working group to study this initiative. And fortunately, the working group released a conclusion that it was against it, and the reintroduction and reinstatement of the death penalty is not in accordance with the international documents, treaties, and as well as the Constitution of Mongolia. And death penalty is an inhumane and cruel punishment and shall not be accepted in any form and circumstances. It is against the right to life, and especially in drug offenses. I agree that drug crimes result in serious damages to the people and society. But we shall remember that who are the main actors, who are the main organizers of crimes that involve drug activities. It can be seen that from the reports and studies, the main players are men, and they use women and children for carrying out their illegal activities, using their vulnerable situation, trust, and thus making them suffer double. Often vulnerable groups, especially women in search of better life, fall victims of drug crimes. And also there are many cases where students, youngsters, get involved in drug trafficking crimes just because they were too naive and trusted their close friends, relatives, tried to help others. This picture can be seen in Mongolia, and I think it is also can be seen usually in less developed but developed. That there are ways to prevent vulnerable groups in getting involved in drug-related crimes and punished by capital punishment. We should focus more on large-scale awareness raising activities, international cooperation of law enforcement agencies with regard to prevention policy, strict control over drug production, drug trade, reduction of poverty, legal empowerment of women, So these are alternatives, and these are the activities that can prevent and from getting involved in drug crimes, and thus the punishment, the capital punishment for drug offenses. I will stop my speech by saying that drug crimes can be prevented by reasonable ways, not by taking human lives. The National Commission, Human Rights Commission of Mongolia will be always on the side to make this world a place with no death penalty. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you for the great information that you shared with us today. Our next session is question and answer, but before we go into that, we are going to have some interventions, and allow me to invite Ms. Erica Martinez, representative of the delegation of Mexico to the UN in Geneva, to take on the interventions. Thank you so much. The floor is yours, Madam Erica.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to all. First, allow me to thank the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty, the Cornell Center of the Death Penalty Worldwide, and the Harm Reduction International for organizing this very timely and relevant event. We appreciate really the very valuable insights and views that have been shared by the panelists. I think it is very important to continue this discussion and to continue exchanging points of view and ways we can work together towards the international trends towards abolition. As you know, in Mexico in 2005, passed a constitutional reform to fully abolish this punishment in our national legal framework. And for the last 15 years, we have been very actively promoting and supporting a range of initiatives on multilateral fora, seeking the abolition or the moratorium on the use of the death penalty worldwide. We do believe that the death penalty compromises human dignity and violates human rights, and thus the protection of persons that are facing this punishment, it's paramount. We have developed a legal assistance program for cases of death penalty to help Mexican citizens facing this punishment abroad. And to this date, it has contributed to avoid or reverse the implementation of death penalty in more than 1,000 cases. In 2020, with the adoption of the Mexican feminist foreign policy, we incorporated a gender perspective that targets the elimination of structural inequalities, of intersectional discrimination, and all types of violence against women and girls. As many of the panelists have pointed out, and as the Secretary General of the UN has already observed, women face a disproportionate and discriminatory application of death penalty. Therefore, it is crucial that we strengthen our efforts to ensure that of any criminal provisions that results in the discriminatory and disproportionate application of death penalty to women are repealed. As we have listened, I think the representative of the Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls mentioned it, and also some other panelists. The patriarchal ideas of women's morality and associated expectations concerning their public and private behavior have detrimental effects for women in the justice system, because they may be subjected to moral judgments which are founded more on social expectations than on the crimes they may have committed. The working group has also highlighted that women are judged more strictly and that they are more likely to be incarcerated for drug-related crimes. Additionally, it is important for us that some women are more vulnerable to facing death penalty due to the multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination on the grounds of ethnicity, race, disabilities, age, migratory status, sexual orientation, and gender identity, among others. Taking this into consideration, we do believe that it's indispensable to incorporate a gender perspective and an intersectional approach to justice. We really want to strengthen our efforts to ensure that legal proceedings observe their rights to equality and non-discrimination. And of course, we welcome this very valuable conversation. We are taking note of everything that has been said. We consider the utmost importance to continue advocating for the protection of the rights of persons facing death penalty, complying, of course, with international obligations. And we look forward to continue working with the core group on death penalty and, of course, with all of you and all the experts in moving this agenda forward. And again, we thank you very much for the opportunity to listen to all these very, very valuable presentations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Erica. Our next presenter is Mr. Lei Tommy, member of the UN Working Group on arbitrary detention. Thank you, sir. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Connie. My name is Lei Tommy. I'm a member of the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention here with my colleague Priya tonight. I just wanted to add my thanks to those already expressed. What a wonderful side event, and thank you so much to the organisers for the invitation and for the very thoughtful report that's been presented by Cornell this evening. In addition to the resources that Priya mentioned, namely our recent drug study on arbitrary detention and drug-related offences, and our deliberation number 12, I wanted to draw your attention to what may be another important advocacy tool that's recently come out of the working group's work, and that is opinion number 72 of 2019, which I'm sure we can post in the chat box at the side as well. It was a case from China, actually, that the working group adopted in November 2019 of a US national. What Delphine was saying before about China and the prevalence of foreign nationals on death row for drug-related offences really resonated with me because of this case. Although it's a male detainee and not a female detainee, the same gender considerations may not have been at play, but the case is nevertheless instructive for some of what the working group said in its opinion. It was a case involving a businessman who was charged with very serious manufacture and trafficking offences and sentenced to the death penalty after what was reportedly an unfair trial, limited access to legal counsel, no arrest warrant, excessive delays in the trial proceedings, and also reported allegations of ill treatment to coerce a confession. And the working group, as far as I know, this is one of the most recent cases from the working group on this topic, made quite a strong statement saying that it couldn't agree with the sentence in this circumstance. It didn't meet the principle of proportionality given the numerous fair trial violations. So I wanted to bring this resource to your attention very briefly. As I said, I think it's instructive for the approach taken to drug-related offences, and it also is a very good example of the kinds of injustices that may happen when the death penalty is imposed in drug-related offences. And as the working group pointed out, it can't be reversed once imposed, of course, and those fair trial rights cannot be reversed in such a serious case. So I'd commend that resource to you. And once again, thank you all very much for the very interesting presentations.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Sorry, I misspelled your name. Sorry about that. On the floor, we have Zavid from OHCR to take the floor. The floor is yours, sir. Kind.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. I would like to also thank all the panelists for their excellent presentation. I would like to, in addition to different tools and reports which has been mentioned, and also in our speaker mentioned about that importance of human rights and public health based approach to the drug policy, and not using the harsher punishment, because these are extreme punishment, and harsher treatment is not useful or not effective to address the drug problem. In this regard, I would like to bring to your attention one specific tool recently which has been published in 2019, that is the International Guidelines on Human Rights and Drug Policy, which was developed with the expert from different institutions, academia, and also civil society and practitioners, with the support of UNDP, OSHA, WHO, UNAIDS, and also UNODC was engaged in the process. And these guidelines provide the clear guidance that how our drug policy could be developed, taking into consideration human rights and public health, as well as evidence. So I wanted to bring that to your attention. It has very specific guidance with regard to death penalty, not using the death penalty, and also a specific chapter on the issue of women in the context of, or gender aspect in the context of drug policy. I think that that tool could be useful for the practitioners as well as our partner to advancing the drug policy at the national level, regional level, or international level, taking consideration human rights and public health approach. Thank you very much.
So much. Thank you so much for being brief. And now I think we are going to our next session and the last session. We are going for question and answer. And we so far have 2 participants who have sent in their questions. Other members who have questions, we still have some little time, kindly join on the board. So I'll give the floor to the first participant to give in the question. Okay, I can read the question. The first question is from Kokila. What are ways that groups committed to abolition of the death penalty and the decriminalization of drugs can build power? What strategies have worked in pushing countries in these directions? Let me read the question again. What are ways that groups committed to abolition of the death penalty and the decriminalization of drugs can build power? What strategies have worked in pushing countries in these directions? Dear panelists, kindly respond to this question. It's from Kokila. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your question, Kokila. I'll have a go at this since it's got more of the decriminalisation aspect in it, and then defer to my fellow panelists. I think when you look at the abolition of the death penalty and you look at decriminalisation of drug offences, you're looking at 2 very complex human rights issues, which for decades, many people around the world believed were a path to create healthier, safer societies. We now know, as my fellow panelists spoke to, there's no evidence to suggest that the death penalty has a deterrent effect on drug offences. And we know after 50 years of the war on drugs that punitive approaches are not working. They're just causing massive amounts of harm. I think when we look around the world and we look at the examples of steps towards more humane drug policy, more gender-sensitive drug policy, we see that where movements align their interests and call for human rights-based agendas together, where we begin to speak to policymakers and begin to disrupt some of the narratives and the stigma around people perceived to be criminals and people's perception of drugs as evil. We explain that it's not that simple, it's quite nuanced. I think we see best case examples of progress when you're able to enter those dialogues.
If I may just briefly build on what Naomi spoke about. Is that fine with you, Connie?
Yes, please, go ahead.
And I'll be brief, actually. On the issue of decriminalization, indeed, that's one of the recommendations made in the working group study, particularly the decriminalization of the use, possession, and acquisition or cultivations of drugs for personal use. And related to that is the issue of possession of drug-related paraphernalia. So there's a slight nuance to the issue of decriminalization, which is this attached issue of drug-related paraphernalia as well. I'm picking up on the point Naomi made in her remarks now and earlier about stigma related to the use of drugs and the challenges that that can give rise to. Another recommendation that is stated in the study is a positive evidence-based messaging through the media as a means to reconfigure the dialogue and to have a different perspective on the issue of drug use. And an overall theme you will find throughout the study is the idea or the movement away from the criminalization aspect, but the evidence-based approach that's advocated. So to address the issue as an evidence-based issue that involves and necessitates the contribution of health providers and other medical providers as such. So that would also be a step in the direction of moving away from criminalization. It's the shifting of the dialogue by seeking to address the issue in another forum, in this case, as a medical issue that then relies on evidence and data. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much. We have another question. She has started by saying, thank you to all the presenters for the presentation. We have addressed drug reform for such a long time, focusing on legal and social structures surrounding the PWD, yet deeper dialogues with some PWD and drug reformists sometimes shows that some remain gender blind, misogynistic, and even against abolishing drug penalty. What are your thoughts of reforming the drug laws, legal and social structures to be gender sensitive and humane, and yet those supposedly advocating it are being inconsistent with their attitude? Any presenter may answer this. Thank you. Can I read again the question?
I think we can see it there, Connie. Thank you so much.
Okay.
This could be a 45-minute answer, but in the context of the 3 minutes remaining in our time together, I think I probably return to that kind of fact about, international drug control is kind of designed to be and is inherently punitive. In many ways, it props up colonial systems which oppress people, all over the world who experience vulnerabilities. So it's not just women who are disproportionately impacted by punitive drug control. Indigenous populations, people of color all around the world, people who are living in poverty, LGBT groups, we're looking at kind of a vast system of inherent harms that impacts most upon the most vulnerable. And so I suppose, it's a work in progress for all of us. And I think that if we're not working together, we're not considering all of our allies in this work to convince people to put in place more humane drug policy, to abolish the death penalty, then we're not going to make progress at all. Thanks, Connie.
Thank you so much. Any other panelists who would want to supplement? Okay. I think even those are the questions we had so far. I think this is we have another last one. Allow me to read it for the purposes of those who cannot read it from the chat. Yes, this is from Kokila Amahali. Has any research pointed to some countries being more willing to sentence men to death than women? For example, in Singapore, men face judicial caning, but women don't. And this difference exists in the law. I'm wondering if in practice, some countries are more willing to use extreme punishments against men. Wow. This question goes to Aisha Humada. Can you briefly share your advocacy approaches towards state actors for drug-related cases, problems? How do you bring women and LGBTQ drug users to advocate for their rights? Okay, thank you so much.
Ya, terima kasih untuk pertanyaannya. Untuk saat ini yang berkaitan dengan pendekatan terhadap aktor negara, LBHM sedang melakukan gugatan untuk terhadap pernyataan war on drugs yang sering kali diucapkan oleh pemerintah dalam memerangi dalam mengadvokasi narkotika. Jadi itu berimplikasi pada banyaknya penahanan massal terhadap orang-orang yang menggunakan narkotika. Sementara untuk membicarakan perempuan dan LGBT, membicarakan hak mereka, kita menggunakan prosedur-prosedur yang tersedia. Misalnya menggunakan ada salah satu peraturan yang khusus dibuat untuk perempuan yang berhadapan dengan hukum. Meskipun aturan itu sudah dikeluarkan sejak tahun 2017 hingga hari ini kami mengadvokasi itu belum ada satupun hakim yang menggunakan peraturan itu dalam memeriksa yang berkaitan dengan perempuan. Seperti itu. Dan memang kami mengakui itu butuh advokasi yang sangat panjang dan strategi-strategi baru berkaitan dengan kondisi politik dan narkotika di Indonesia. Terima kasih.
Thank you so much. Ms. Delphi, you wanted to say?
I know we're out of time, but if everyone has a moment, I could quickly respond to Kokila's question. So there's your question is one that's often asked, and there's no body of research that points to the idea that men are going to be more likely than women to be sentenced to death or to be sentenced to extreme punishments. And we have tried to actually answer a different question, and one that hasn't been in our minds sufficiently asked, which is looking at women who are sentenced to death. What are the factors that lead to them being singled out for this most extreme of punishments? And are they connected to gender-based discrimination? And our answer is heartily yes. We see that gender-based stereotypes, that gendered narratives, expectations of the way women are supposed to behave play a role in women in courts being willing to sentence women to the most extreme punishment. And the way this is often described is, or the way we often described it, as when women are found to have transgressed a gendered norm of behavior, in addition to having committed an offense, there is a higher likelihood that courts will be issuing a harsher punishment. And so that's why the title of our first report was Judged for More Than Her Crime, because the women who are sentenced to death are those who are described by judges as bad mothers, unfaithful wives, ungrateful daughters, women who defy the expectations that are placed upon them by society. And those implicit judgments by the court are not legal, and they're not reviewed, and they are widespread. And that is part of what we are trying to bring to light and address in our work.
Thank you so much, Ms. Delphine. Now we've come to the closing session. Before we close, let me take this opportunity to thank you all, our dear panelists. You've been so great. You've spoken great words. You've done research, and we acknowledge you for that. Thank you for the time that you put in to see to it that the presentation that have been submitted for this side event have been censored, and we've heard and listened to you, and the information given has been the truth. Thank you so much for allowing me to be your chair. I hope, and I think I've not been so harsh on you. Thank you for being good time managers. And before I close, I'm giving the floor to any panelists who want to say a brief closing remark. Is there anyone? Okay. No one. That means that everyone has understood and everyone is confident with whatever he or she has presented. Thank you. Oh, okay. The floor is yours, Delphi.
Thank you. I'm just taking the floor because I would like the last word to belong to Mary Utami, who wrote a beautiful preamble for our report, which I encourage everyone to read, a prologue. And I want to end with her words. I want the world to know that we, women on death row, are suffering inwardly. Women often keep their struggles to themselves, even though they are unconsciously destroying themselves. But people can and must learn from the experiences of women, so women must open up and tell their stories. This is our story. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much.